Airport Communities Podcast. I am your host for today, J.C. Harris. Friends, what people want to talk about is what we haven't talked about. But we're going to talk about it today. Today is about what everybody always wants to talk about, flight paths. Why haven't we talked about flight paths? Couple of reasons. First, it's crazy complicated. It's so complicated. In fact, in a first for the Airport Communities Podcast, this is a two-part episode. The other thing, generally, we want to talk about things we can do something about now. And we didn't want to do just another episode that was essentially, here's why you can't have what you want, kid. But, spoiler alert, that is the majority of this part one of our two-parter. And it gets worse because you have to wait for part two to get to the, uplifting punchline. Now, for most people coming into these issues, the solution is always going to be to do whatever it takes to make the planes go somewhere else. It's so overpowering, we get it, and people will probably never stop obsessing over that. But it would also be fair to say that the majority of time, money, and effort airport communities all around America have expended over the past 50 years in doing so has been in vain. At bottom, we're still stuck with the same basic technology as 50 years ago. The problem is, the 400,000-pound tubes we currently have going 200 miles an hour cannot do the things communities living under the flight path need them to do. It's just physics. Or is it? If you go on YouTube, you can see any number of video clips with amazing vertical ascents and almost kamikaze-like descents. Look, we know that you know that these aircraft do not function like that in day-to-day operations. But what we've learned is that a surprising number of people, especially those negatively impacted by these aircraft, will greatly overestimate what is possible given the current fleet. You really want to think about these things more like super tankers on the high seas. Any maneuver takes a while. The system we're about to discuss represents the day-to-day practical limits, left, right, up, and down, of what is essentially a 50-year-old technology. And speaking of ancient technology, in our last episode, we spent a certain amount of time not only providing the background on environmental law in the United States, we called it NEPA, but throwing a certain amount of shade at our own legendary federal electeds, many of whom, paradoxically, were key players in creating NEPA. It's just a fact that as a group, they have been and continue to be extremely protectionist of a monopoly, meaning Boeing, and their most popular platforms are now, 50 years old. There was an article recently in the Seattle Times bemoaning the departure of the now ancient MD-11. In Europe, Lufthansa continues to invest in a large fleet of 747s. We'll keep coming back to how much technology, both ancient and new, affects what is possible in changing flight paths over your neighborhood. But now, on with the show. We're going to begin with the tower, which is what you probably think means air traffic control. But from a community perspective, the tower doesn't really matter the way most people think. Control in the air is done by another group of people in a different building called the TRACON. Terminal Radar Approach Control. Our TRACON just happens to be on the same airport property, but it doesn't have to be. These buildings don't even need windows. It's all electronic. For example, Newark, which shares the same airspace as LaGuardia and JFK, its TRACON is over in Philadelphia. Given all the challenges they've been having recently, we leave it to you to decide whether or not that is, a great idea. Most of the time, the tower handles operations on the ground. Once the plane gets up in the air, the TRACON takes control. Foreshadowing alert, note how I said for the most part. For departures, the TRACON lines them up, sequences them, they call it, and assigns them a procedure called a SID, a Standard Instrument Departure. For incoming aircraft, it's kind of the same in reverse. They order them in a proper sequence and assign them a procedure called a STAR, Standard Terminal Arrival, and that routes them down to the runway. Beyond that TRACON boundary, there are a couple of dozen big en route centers, they call them, throughout the United States. They monitor the planes along the superhighways crossing our great nation. And then when those aircraft get within 40 to 60 miles of the airport, they're handed off to the TRACON. Oops, sorry, that's not the TRACON. That's that episode of Star Trek where the little kid is operating the ginormous spaceship. It's excellent. Anyway, this is one visualization for the TRACON boundary we'll come back to, not only because it indicates the change in who controls aircraft, en route versus TRACON, but see all those little squiggly things that look like Corbomite maneuver? They have a lot to do with what is possible for us flight path changey-wise. You can think of those SIDs and STARs within the TRACON as a dozen or so on and off ramps to that superhighway, or as the FAA likes to call it, the railroad in the sky. But we don't want to take that comparison too far. You'll sometimes see these individual procedures, pilots call them plates, and they look a little like a road map, but they're not a road map. If you think about a Google map, a flight procedure isn't the map part. It's more like the turn-by-turn directions. When you get to this landmark waypoint, turn 40 degrees, go left, right, with the added fun of up or down. And because it's the FAA, each of these procedures has another one of those goofy acronyms. Glazer, chins, banger, jawbone. We've tried to find out if they actually mean something, and we've been told no, they just make them up. And in fact, the names don't really matter. What matters is that there are a very small number of these procedures by which all aircraft are navigated within the TRACON. Now, most of the time when the Port of Seattle presents about noise and flights, they'll put up something like this, which we call spray art, because it will show all flights on a given day, and it just looks overwhelming. But that spray of 1,000 or more flights obscures the fact that they are really just those dozen procedures repeated over and over. What causes all this spray is the variability. The aircraft aren't following a lane. The pilot is navigating towards a particular waypoint and making a particular type of turn, but as we'll see, the variability at each of those points can be several miles wide, or it can be as precise as 100 yards. Why those particular on and off ramps? Why those particular procedures? Just as with the SAMP today, the FAA and airports are supposed to do an environmental review when developing any overall system of procedures. They do studies, hold public comment, and have to get approval that this big framework does not violate environmental law. And just to put a fine point on this, that environmental review is not on individual procedures. It is approving the framework. the set of overall rules by which each TRACON can create its own ongoing set of procedures. The things that have to be studied and the process for doing so are generally referred to as NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Because this is environmental law, it's about 9 layers deeper than that. But for now, when we say NEPA, it's a shorthand for the overall federal policy framework we described in our last episode, Honk If You Love California. NEPA organizes the things that need to be studied for any significant project like this into a series of categories. These include things like tribal lands, impacts to wildlife, a certain number of historic buildings, a limited number of federally recognized pollutants to air, land, and water, and who can forget that other ancient technology, the noise impact analysis system known as DNL. See previous episodes on that. But note that there is no fixed limit on either quantity or time of day for those flights. As long as you comply with the overall limits in each category, you're good. There are a few other categories they're required to study which sound great, like socioeconomics, community impacts, and so on, but we think it's a little cynical that they're even required to do so because they offer no practical limits to flight operations. For example, no amount of socioeconomic impacts are any reason to change flight paths. Put a pin in that. The current system is derived from a decision made in 1990 called the 4-post plan. And you can see why it's called that. You know, there's a post up here, a post up there, one down here, one down there. They're really 4 corners. Aircraft head for one of those corners, and they're supposed to zipper merge, you know, like when you go in and out of I-5, you know, that's what it is. A couple of things to point out. First, you might think that it would be like the federal tax code, thousands of lines and loopholes and complexity and so on. Au contraire. The entire 4-post plan order, including cover letter, is 8 pages. The meat of the document is less than 3. Even though each procedure may be super complicated, the rules for determining whether or not any of them conform to environmental regs, which is, you know, all communities should care about, are simple. Second, the analysts do a ton of work, supposedly to provide the least noise impact for the largest number of people. But let's be clear, that doesn't mean the least noise for everyone. It's what we keep referring to as the greater good argument. The premise is that improvements to operational efficiency will also yield the greatest community benefit in terms of noise and pollution for the largest number of people. Win-win. The FAA does not guarantee quiet for any residential area. However, if you recall, impacts to wildlife are one of the categories that have to be studied. And unlike so many of the other categories, they do have some pretty well-defined limits. The Port of Seattle has spent millions of dollars protecting birds like raptors, typically by moving them as far as possible from the runways, and not just moving them, getting them settled in to a nice, comfy environment. Not only because they're such swell people, but because they are required to do so by the NEPA process. We joke about it, but it's not really a joke. If you really wanted to protect your waterfront neighborhood from flights, you'd find some scientist who could prove conclusively once and for all that aircraft noise was harmful to the reproductive capabilities of orcas. We know what you're thinking. It sounds like we're going off the rails here, but we're beating on this because if you're listening, you're concerned about flight paths. And NEPA is clear on this point. There are very, 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 very few triggers to stop projects like Flight Paths. One of the only unambiguous reasons to do so is the protection of wildlife that cannot be moved. People? That's a whole other kettle of fish. Now let's talk about the parking lot, the runways. Sea-Tac has a simple geometry. The airport will complain about limited land, but that simplicity also has a lot of advantages. Yes, there are airports with much more land, but the runways also go in 6 different directions, which creates a whole other set of challenges. As we'll see, Sea-Tac's simple north-south configuration is not a practical hindrance to future expansion, but it does limit the FAA's options for moving flight paths around. We'll come back to both those. Now, the 4-post plan says that all flights should normally approach and depart using one of those 4 posts. And either they head straight in, or if they're headed in the wrong direction, do a button hook at the waypoint. We'll give you an example. The infamous HAWKZ, the one that people on Vashon Island find currently so disruptive. Aircraft in Southflow, note Southflow, enter the TRACON heading north. They have to first go over Puget Sound, then make that big turn north of Seattle so they can then do the final approach from the north and land in Southflow. Confusing, right? I guess we need to talk about flow. Flow means the direction of travel. At Sea-Tac, aircraft on all 3 runways only operate in one direction at a time, north or south. So in my example, regardless of the compass point that the aircraft is coming from, they all end up arriving heading south. And that means they are also taking off heading south. Get it? All one direction. But sometimes they flip that so that everything is heading north. Planes are approaching from the south, arriving north to land, and then taking off into the north. Now, why do they do that? Something called prevailing winds. If you've seen any old movie with propeller planes, the wind used to be a very big deal in terms of one's ability to get up in the air safely. Pilots are always checking the wind. Today, with all these turbofan jet engines, these monsters can take off and land pretty much in either direction. Still a bit more efficient to do so with the prevailing wind, but meteorology has become far less of an issue in recent decades. The prevailing winds in our beautiful part of Puget Sound tend to favor south flow about 2/3 of the year. Generally in the summer, when the weather warms for a couple of months, the majority of traffic seems to shift into north flow. But as you can see, these are averages. They change flow all the time. And although this is not often explained, people who live under the 3rd runway understand it intuitively. They have noticed the north flow conga line, especially on busy nights like Sunday. We'll go into the technicalities in another episode, but the 3rd runway is uniquely efficient for arrivals. The airport may say that it's just coincidence, but statistically speaking, they do seem to shift into north flow for those peak banking periods. We discussed banking in episode 19. Without rehashing that, whenever anyone talks about technological limits, just look at these big honking turbofan jet engines. Winds, schmins. The 4-post plan was developed before the 3rd runway. We mention that because a third runway was not part of their consideration. The people screaming about that four-post plan and suing over it mostly were not the people living nearest the runway. The complaints were more from North Seattle and what is now Federal Way, the populations at the two posts. Now, why are those corners, those posts, those button hooks where they are? It gets back to the 400,000-pound tube. At a certain distance from the runway, the aircraft has to be at a certain altitude, and that plane does not want to go side to side. Those four corners kind of have to be where they are. 2 runways, 3 runways. It's that north-south geometry. We recommend that everyone read at least the cover letter of the four-post plan. We completely understand how enraging it must have been to residents of that time. It comes across as completely dismissive of their concerns. And you may think it was written by the same people who wrote almost the same letters approving the third runway and the SAMP, because the rules ain't changed. However, we understand the rationale behind it. Take a look at the top of that zipper merge. There is now a more even balance left and right. And as we look at flight dispersion patterns throughout the airspace, there are several other trends, all meant to increase efficiency, that is, to allow more flights. But there is that greater good argument, the win-win. They also have the effect of spreading the pain more evenly outside the 4 to 6 nautical mile area where the planes do have room to maneuver, and then making their tracks even tighter where they don't. An equal opportunity offender. No protection for people used to quiet, no relief for people feeling greater and greater concentration. Sorry, we need to beat on that greater good argument one more time. During the lawsuit, many public comments referenced the number 133. There were now expected as many as 133 flights over areas that previously had almost none. Over and over, residents used that particular number to suggest it would spell the end of their neighborhood. Contrast that with neighborhoods within the 4 to 6 mile straight shot now. They're experiencing over 1,000 operations every day. Okay, back to the runway. As aircraft arrive, you'll hear about something called a glide slope, which is a slight misnomer. On final approach, the plane is definitely not gliding. It's still using power. The glide slope is essentially a pair of radio beacons at the foot of each runway. It goes beep, beep. It actually doesn't make that sound, but the aircraft hears it, and that allows for controlling the angle of descent precisely, 3 degrees. They are remarkably consistent. People constantly complain about aircraft coming in lower and louder and so on, but it's not as simple as that. We're not discounting people's experience, but that is also another episode. Now, some airports do have a slightly steeper angle of descent. You can totally change it, and it will provide some small benefit, particularly at the edge of that 4 to 6 mile straight-in shot. Trivia Pursuit Challenge, STNI edition. One of the 6th arrival paths is not 3 degrees. It's 2.75. Bonus points to anyone writing in with the correct answer. Since about 1975, the Sea-Tac Communities Plan, right up until 2018, a certain number of residents around Federal Way have asked for it to be changed. Not to make it steeper than normal, just to bring it up to the industry standard. In fact, the physical procedure for changing it is, it's just kind of like moving an antenna. Not exactly rocket surgery, but it has never been implemented, and it's not in the current SAMP document neither. So why is it so tough to change? Well, it's the same as most airport advocacy. Like everything, it requires an FAA form and a lot of follow-up. Concerned residents come and go every few years. So when the next group of people hear about it, the port just may act like it's some big new idea. I mean, come on, guys, it's 50 years old. Over the decades, the FAA, the port, and the airlines have all provided different explanations as to why making even such minor changes for community benefit are so fraught. Many other airports offer a steeper angle of descent, but that's predominantly in Europe. In America, you really do have to have buy-in from carriers. Not only for this, but for all kinds of other stuff communities should care about. Takeoff and landing, reverse thrust, engine run-ups, and so on. In America, the airlines and pilots play an important part in every decision along every flight path. We keep using the term HAWKZ, but currently the procedure is known as HAWKZ 8. And that is because there used to be a HAWKZ 7. And a HAWKZ 6 and a HAWKZ 5. They tweaked these slightly over time, often because new obstructions to navigation become known. The point is, you can, and they do, make slight alterations over time. There is also a web page from the FAA where you, concerned resident, can suggest a procedure change. We've heard of people filing such change requests and then hearing back, 5 years later. And if we were the boss, we would ask them to take that down. It's as though the FAA might be implying that changing a flight path through the national airspace is on the same level as, installing a local crosswalk. We hate false hope. There was an updated version of the four-post plan around 2012, which you may have heard about as greener skies or NextGen. You'll hear terms like PBN, performance-based navigation, and ADS-B, automated dependent surveillance broadcast. I'm amazed I got that right. The notion was and is to start taking advantage of improvements in technology to make flight paths more precise. This is when you start to get revisions to several of the biggest flight procedures, which are called RNAV. That refers to the GPS control. That is what allows for so much tighter flight paths. The control now is down to about 100 yards. You can almost think you're looking at one flight until you get to the button hook. And by the way, this is not just latitude and longitude, left and right. It's also up and down and front to back. How closely you can space the flights one after another. Oh my God, I just flipped to the next page. They want me to talk about Recat. I can't even say it. It's just Recat. A 400,000-pound tube going 200 miles an hour generates wake. Turbulence, like a boat, race cars. So you don't want to get too close. Front to back, side to side, even up and down. And if we had to oversimplify the job of an air traffic controller, boil it down into one word, which we would never do, that word would be separation. The job of air traffic control is to keep aircraft separated. Not too close, not too far, just right. For decades and decades, those rules were very simple and very conservative. When it comes to wake, front to back, a lot of it came down to the difference in weight between the plane in the front and the plane in the back. And to give you a sense of just how conservative these rules could be, remember that ancient MD-11 we opened with? Now used mostly for cargo. Back in the day, those type of aircraft. And oddly enough, Boeing 757s, remember them? Very different kind of aircraft. But they'd both be lumped together in this group called heavies and kept separated from other aircraft by as much as 5 minutes. Not anymore. By the way, when describing aviation impacts, it's often more useful to speak about distance in terms of time, minutes, seconds. And over time, with all those newfangled computers and studies of physics and aerodynamics, really smart people realized that they could space existing aircraft front to back much tighter. And they call that wake recategorization. Hey, I said it. Like RNAV, GPS, electronic navigation, wake recat was a core concept of NextGen. But in this case, the tech isn't in any new equipment. It's basically learning how to do the same tasks more efficiently with the equipment you've got. It was essentially free money. And what makes it even better is if they are similar aircraft, they can be spaced even tighter. Put a pin in that because we'll come back to it. Remember, wins schmins. But we want to pause here to remind listeners that another promise of NextGen was that greater good argument. It would also provide a tremendous community benefit. Think about it. We've gone beyond changing a flight path. We're now talking about how we can maximize throughput on an existing flight path. If you can sequence the flights in a tighter formation, the negative impacts will be experienced by even fewer people, which is great if you're not one of fewer people. But if you're in one of the neighborhoods that is subject to that greater concentration on that straight shot to and from the runways, all you'll notice are the planes getting closer and closer together. No longer 5 minutes apart, 3 minutes apart, but sometimes 43 seconds. If you're watching on video, although these aircraft may appear quite a long distance from one another, they are all less than 2 minutes apart, front to back. That is typical for peak banking periods, what you call the conga line. They call wake recategorization. Okay, we just finished talking about front-to-back separation. Earlier, we talked about side-to-side separation, further out. So now we should talk about side-to-side separation at the runway, meaning parallel arrivals and departures, which never used to be a thing at Sea-Tac. If you're watching on video, this image is from SFO, by the way. But people are noticing them more and more here. And that is also due to improvements both in electronic navigation and in our understanding of aerodynamics. We've talked about this before, but back in the day when they built the second runway, it was considered too close to the first, the eastern runway, to do parallel takeoffs and landings, like you'd assume would be the case with a normal two-runway airport. The FAA referred to them as two dependent runways, meaning that if you want to use both, you pretty much have to stagger arrivals and departures. Definitely better than one, but not nearly as good for throughput as two truly independent pathways. You can see this for yourself in any aerial photo of the runways. The skid marks on the eastern runway have always been just black, 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 because it gets so much more use. Now, the third runway essentially afforded the airport the ability to act like a normal two-runway airport. During that construction, there was a great deal of controversy over usage, winds and weather and so on, but again, that's for another episode. For now, just understand that with the advent of AI, our better understanding of physics, and continued improvements in tech like GPS, their ability to manage things like turbulence will continue to improve, and there will be more parallel operations. And more Sea-Tac will function like the for reals 3-runway airport you already thought it was. Greener Skies was the last major review of FlightPaths. As with the 4-post plan, there were a bunch of complaints, mostly from North Seattle, and they got even less traction than with the 4-post plan. We'll actually be doing another episode on that because, ironically, by the FAA's own standards, NextGen has not exactly been a roaring success. As just one example, going back to HAWKZ, all the remaining variability at that button hook, miles and miles north and south and east and west, that was also supposed to be tightened up by NextGen. And if you believe, that would have reduced noise over North Seattle. That did not happen. Sharp-eared listeners will also note that we have focused our attention almost entirely on that northwest corner. That was partly to keep it simple, and partly because, well, frankly, they never got around to developing optimized procedures in various spots, like that east side. Funny thing. We said we'd come back to those en route centers and the handoff with the TRACON. People in areas most concerned about a possible second airport are also noticing more flights over their communities. And that's because they're sitting on one of those handoff points from the en route center into our TRACON's airspace. That is also just the inevitable consequence of flight concentration. So regardless of whether or not there is ever another airport, there are going to be more flights over those transitions. Remember when I made my little infantile Star Trek Corbomite maneuver gag? I fought for that. All of those blobs are things that aircraft already have to navigate to and around. I wanted that not just because I'm a big kid, but because every visualization we've seen for every airport really makes it look like they're on rails. It understates the complexity of the airspace once you get within the TRACON. We were a bit critical of the spray art visualization earlier. If you're watching on video, this one's a little better. In addition to Sea-Tac, there's Painfield, Boeing Field, Renton, JBLM. Again, we know that you know all this intellectually, but even this visualization understates what's going on. What the FAA really should do is a spray art 24 hours around the TRACON. That is mind-blowing. We'll come back to this in part 2 to help explain why moving capacity anywhere is so fraught. And at the risk of sounding like internet clickbait, the answer will surprise you. Because the entire system now is so tightly integrated, any discussion of flight paths, even in an area that seems totally pristine, now requires just a ton of planning. But not always. In fact, sometimes they can even be automated. All agencies operating under environmental permits, including the FAA, can occasionally implement what's called a categorical exclusion, a CADEX. Call it a semi-free pass. They're not the same as those categories we mentioned regarding NEPA. Remember, this is government work, so everything can always get more complicated. All you need to know for now is that exclusion really means exceptions. There's a whole list of exceptions which the public generally does not see because the FAA considers them routine. In principle, just like the tweaks, the ongoing minor revisions to the main procedures like HAWKZ. And if nobody notices, like the tree falling in the forest, that means they got it right. It wasn't worth going through all that paperwork. But wouldn't you know it, in 2016, the FAA had created a CADX over Sea-Tac Airport, the Burien 250. And somebody definitely did notice. Total cliffhanger.